Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Design for Equitable Systems. And we're going to talk today about understanding problem spaces. This will build off of our lecture from earlier this week on what is an injustice and how do you identify that, as well as analyze its connection to history. And hopefully this will be your next step in creating, the start to your social justice journey. The readings will hopefully get you to understand a little bit more about why problem space definition has flaws, especially in the current way it's done, and get you thinking about why the community is important for this work that we'll talk about today in this lecture. So, review of identifying injustices. Yes, if we are biased, which we all are, we are likely to perpetuate it. And so critically understanding the things that we don't know is important if we are to move forward in a way that is community driven and will address these systemic issues. And knowing that injustices are products of discrimination is essential. Like, we need to know that this is a chosen act. This is something that people have intended to do and so replicated over millennium in different ways. And so the more that we're aware that this is where they come from, the better we are to identify them over short-term inconveniences that often aren't as targeted and systemic as an injustice. And your best bet for learning about injustices is connecting with people. If you're not in a space right now where you can connect with them physically, it's connecting over message, friending people, following the right pages, reading, all of these ways in which you can get with a community that is facing the injustice, because you need to enter the space without an imagined idea of what the community needs. And that's the only way you can really build essential context for what is really needed in a community that design can be a powerful tool to address. And all of this comes with an untangling of histories. We are all makeups of our lived experiences and the lived experiences of those that have come before us. They define the people we are today and also the opportunities we have today. And so it's really important in working in any injustice space to untangle the history of that injustice as it has faced that community. And these questions, we talked about last time, hopefully give you that starting point. And this is finally, we talked about this tactic, the equity pause, which really helps you, in any stage of your design process, but especially in the beginning when you're defining the problem, which is one of the most essential steps, to really make sure that you're analyzing every part of your action, every part of your learning to improve your capability to solve the problem, and make sure that you're naming existing barriers that you might face to addressing the challenge. And this is a nice way, again, to frame the ways that you've been thinking about the problem that is historically relevant and based in people's needs and their beliefs and essential understandings of their needs. So this is just a nice thing that is a good framing to kick off this conversation about problem spaces, as this framework is something that we need to build upon in order to improve your analysis of problems and readiness to address those facing communities that you care about and injustices that you care about. So the empathy problem. If you have ever studied design, you'll know that the human-centered design process written by IDEO that is taught at the D School, taught at numerous institutions across the country, starts with empathize. But there's a problem. When we design for someone else, this quote's from the Empathy Problem article, we are designing for an interpretation of their needs, and the more divergent our experiences from theirs, the more likely it is we are wrong. And this is the common problem, is that empathy cannot be commodified. It is very difficult to just treat empathy like a step that makes us the perfect designers for a specific space or problem without a lot of learning and a lot of, combinations of learning from lived expertise. Design thinking, as it's known, has often sold a false narrative that empathy can be the equally important as understandings of lived experience. And this is because we're often interpreting needs from our lens. The world that we've lived in shapes the way that we see others and their problems. And those in power often hold the control over the levers of change when it comes to design thinking. The article particularly talked about how white men are often more often than not in the leadership roles of design organizations. And with the design field becoming more popular, it is white men in positions of power determining the ways forward. There has been a call to action to analyze racial injustices. That's still something that's developing, and challenging empathy, I think, would be part of that process. And often empathy-based reasoning can lead to negative impacts for those in power. The article you read or will read will talk about how, because diverse people aren't in the room, algorithms are more likely to not recognize Black faces. Seatbelts often will not protect women, especially pregnant women. And more often than not, a lot of technologies are not built for trans individuals. So this is not in this article, but it's another example of how TSA technology, specifically when you're determined man or woman, is looking for features on the body that are male or female. So being trans, it's more likely to kind of out you as trans. So there's many technologies that, because empathy has been commodified, these people are not represented in the room, and then these technologies don't work for them. So diverse voices are needed in the room to inclusively assess inequities. Without them there, we're unlikely to even learn about these processes. Even if we're doing interviews, it's not going to come up if we're not asking the right questions or not having that information already there from the start. And this comes to the article from Chicago Beyond of Why Am I Always Being Researched? Which this was a quote that a Black man asked a researcher, I think from Chicago Beyond, basically saying, why is this the case? Why am I a study subject? Why am I in 3 different studies and I never see the actual impact on me as an individual? And if evidence matters, we must care how it gets made. So much of our world is determined on numerical evidence. We have to see the intervention works before we scale it. But the thing is, there are many ways in which bias comes into the room when we're collecting evidence that often marginalizes community-based interventions, kind of puts them aside in the pursuit of a higher, powerful funder's goals. And privilege will shape your knowledge. This is, as we've seen, who controls history will control what we know, and communities have entirely different histories that we don't know because of privilege. But research is a very extractive process. It makes you, especially if you're poor and marginalized in this country, you can feel like you're continuously being studied without actually seeing the gains of the research. And often biases in the research will lead to incorrect analysis, especially when the people analyzing the research are not those with lived experience. I can interpret this in a lens beyond a commodification of empathy. And research is often not owned by those closest to inequities. Research is gained from those in powerful roles and used often for their own studies and their own advancement of their careers. And so this makes research just a very, complicated space. And we need more ethical analysis of our research, especially because gaining knowledge from others is the way that we can do better design. And this is the framework that I'll run through really quickly with y'all that Chicago Beyond put together to challenge different ways in which inequities show up in research, which affects the ways that community organizations can do their works, the way that researchers understand problems, and the ways that funders can actually fund interventions that are meaningful. So to challenge, this is challenging the powers in research, we need to challenge access. People need to be able to participate in research on their own terms and determine the research that will benefit their community. More often than not, we are coming in because we have an agenda and a thesis that we're looking to validate, versus coming into the community saying, what can we research to benefit you? When we talk about information, people need to be able to get consent to studies. They need to be able to give, like, what are you going to use this data for? Why do you need this data from me particularly? And how can we ensure that this data is going to be coming back to serve our needs? Validity. Communities, again, I've said this probably so much, of course, they must be authorities and be able to value their ability to sit at a table with researchers from more established, powerful institutions. And often should be able to say, check researchers when they say, hey, what you're saying right now is not the way that we are interpreting this. This is not the way our lived experiences work. And ownership, know what groups want to learn and ensure ownership over that data. Make sure that you're not just coming in with your agenda and saying what you want. You are making sure that research is a mutual beneficial process. More ways to challenge power in research. Value. Recognize the true costs of doing research and work to address those costs. This is often connected to the fact that researchers will often research marginalized communities, take up their time, and not pay community members. They're not paying them for the time that they might be taking off of work or caring for their children. Also realizing there's many costs doing research that go beyond these physical times. And there's a lot of emotional burden to doing research and extracting from those stories. And we have to, we have to acknowledge that this is a part of the research study, that if we're going to be doing this, we need to make sure that we're delivering value in the end to communities and understanding the impacts we're having. Accountability, making sure that you have trust in your relationships, you know the context, and you own your missteps when you mess up. Because that's the only way that you can build a long-term relationship that doesn't just feel like a one-time study or a one-time thing which never derives any value. Because research can be a powerful tool, we have to make sure that it's accountable and delivering long-term value. And finally, authorship. This is a critical part, especially we don't really do it in design, is we don't account for the way that we have learned from others and the way that they have made the study what it is. And so to frame, we have to look at making sure that communities co-own these projects, these studies, and framing as well with an equity lens, that we are working not just to prove our points, but to make sure the data shows that there are historic inequities, and these must be accounted for if we're going to do good justice work. So hopefully now you'll be ready to do some good, responsible analysis of problems. So now we're going to do some equitable problem-based definition. How to make sure that when you understand an injustice and you're starting to learn about it, that you can move forward in a way that includes all and works towards justice. My slide. Oh no! Okay, we're gonna fix this really quick because I don't know what happened. Let's present. Cool. Little pause. Assessing the needs. So, these are the steps you can take to ensure that your needs assessment is responsible and community driven. Making sure that if you have an agenda or an objectives list coming in, that it is understandable and uses language that is easy to grasp by many people, from young people to elders. Making sure that you have multiple ways to gather feedback. Making sure that you're not just like, I'm going to have one meeting and then I'm going to determine the problem and it's going to be great. But you have multiple people involved too, making sure that you're hearing all different kinds of voices, especially those that might not even physically be able to access the spaces that you're holding your events in. And this goes to my point about ensuring all types of people are included, from young people to people with disabilities to people who work multiple jobs. This is the only way that you can really get a good framework and understanding of a community need. Making sure that you don't go too big at first. I think it can be very, common to just want to be like, I'm going to solve this big problem. But sometimes it's really easy. It's actually easy to kind of narrow down and scope down to something particularly relevant that people have been saying, and then use brainstorming and ideation tools that we'll talk about later to expand the realm of ideas that all kind of start to address the injustice that you've heard. Making sure that throughout all these, that you're getting continuous input on these problem assessments. Brainstorm about needs. Don't just say, these are the needs from what I've heard, but rather, can you validate what I've heard? Can you give me some more ideas about these problem spaces? And more often than not, you'll find that you're having a very robust understanding of community needs. So collecting some pledges for action. This is an activity from Creative for Action Lab, but it's a very simple framework. And very easy to just get a bunch of people to fill some of this stuff out so that you can analyze it and find steps to move forward. So the basic framework is, I will make X better. X is your community, your source of a population that you're working to benefit. You will make them better by blank. So that is where you include an action that you're taking to improve community well-being and improve livelihoods. So to make sure that you understand what this is, here's my example from this project, which y'all are all a part of. I will make educational institutions better by giving young people the tools to make meaningful, sustainable, and systemic change. And this will be something you would collect and be able to interpret and understand to get to the point where you can find the trends to determine the actions that you can take to start to make responsible movements. And that's it. I hope that was helpful. To close, just this another quote. Just know that design thinking and design processes and many problem-solving processes, even research, frequently will marginalize groups by making sure that, those voices are collected and mediated through the lens of people in power who know little of their experience. To make sure that we're determining problem spaces equitably to form the foundation of our work, we must ensure that we are not only learning from people in an equitable way, but including them in the processes of determining the equitable space that we'll be working in for different parts of the problem-solving process. And just making sure that we must reject these gatekeeping mechanisms that often will keep us from addressing systemic challenges because they're often based on numerical metrics that are one-time things that address one thing in the bird cage but are not attacking the entire cage. So your next readings. Next week will be about partnerships and coalition building, which I'm really excited about. So we'll be talking about how to work with people you don't agree with, how to build powerful coalitions, and how to map power in a space to best uplift communities. So excited for it. And as always, if you have questions, just email me, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. And I'll see you next week.